Yeah, Brexit affects a lot of people that didn't want that to happen. But Brits have to accept the loss of their EU citizenship because of Brexit now. The ECJ ruled that this was a sovereignty-made decision by the United Kingdom. And that means British nationals cannot automatically retain their rights as EU citizens after Brexit. And on Thursday, the European Court of Justice, the famous ECJ, ruled that way. British nationals residing in the UK and several EU member countries argued that the Brexit withdrawal agreement would strip them of the rights they would have exercised and acquired as EU citizens. And the plaintiffs had requested that the court annul in part the EU's January 2020 decision to approve the withdrawal agreement. Britons have to accept that they lost their EU citizenship as a result of Brexit. And the European Court of Justice finally dismissed 3 corresponding lawsuits in Luxembourg. The loss of EU citizenship is an automatic consequence of the UK's sovereign decision to leave the Union. And as you all know, in 2016, a majority of British voters voted in favour of the United Kingdom leaving the EU. Britain then informed the European Council of its intention to leave the EU, Article 50, you remember, and the corresponding agreement on Brexit was signed in January 2020. The Council of the EU approved this agreement on behalf of the EU by decision on January 20th in 2020, and finally on January 31st in 2020, the United Kingdom withdrew from the EU. But not all British nationals agree with Brexit and its consequences. British citizens unsuccessfully challenged the Brexit agreement and the Council decision in 3 separate cases at the General Court of the European Union. And they claimed inter alia that this deprived them of the rights they had exercised and acquired as EU citizens. The loss of their EU citizenship due to Brexit in 2020 will have to be accepted by the citizens of Great Britain, though. And according to the European Court of Justice now, this is an automatic consequence of the decision taken by the United Kingdom to withdraw from the Union, but not of actionable decisions by the EU. And complaints before the EU courts are therefore inadmissible. You all remember the Brexit referendum, and the 52% of the voters of that day voted that way. And after long negotiations, the negotiated Brexit agreement was approved in the British House of Lords finally, and in the EU Council in January 2020, and then it was signed. And then Britain finally left the EU. But several UK citizens still claim that Brexit has deprived them of rights which they would have exercised and acquired without Brexit. And some of the plaintiffs live in different EU states in which they used to be automatically allowed to work and live as EU citizens at the time. And they complained about the agreement and its approval by the Council. The First Instance Court of the European Union already dismissed the lawsuits as inadmissible in June 2021, and the ECJ now followed suit because they took it there as well. At the ECJ, the plaintiffs were unsuccessful and the lawsuits were dismissed now, of course. And this just meant that the ECJ had to deal with the consequences of Brexit once again. That happened a lot of times before. However, the latter agreed with the opinion of the EUG and rejected the appeals lodged against the decisions. That means that British citizens have no interest in legal protection in the EU in this case. If natural persons wish to defend themselves against acts of the member states affecting them, they must prove a specific need for legal action. Article 263 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU presupposes that the plaintiffs must be the addressees of the respective act or must be directly or individually affected by it. However, the ECJ emphasizes that the exit decision is based solely on the will of the member state concerned and thus depends solely on its sovereign decision. British citizens therefore lost their EU citizenship and the rights as a result of the UK's sovereign decision to withdraw from the Union. And with regard to the withdrawal agreement or the decision of the Council of the EU approving this agreement, there is therefore a lack of the necessary concern. And the ECJ therefore found that the actions were rightly dismissed as inadmissible. And a lot of people were talking about sovereignty but there was the sovereignty of Britain to decide to leave the EU. And it was up to the voters in Great Britain to do something about this. A lot of the younger ones, as we know, didn't go there, and the older ones voted the way we know. And so the result on that day came. The judges in Luxembourg have now ruled that the plaintiffs lack the necessary interest in legal protection. The unsurprising ruling confirms that people from third countries or former member states can only acquire EU citizenship if they acquire the citizenship of a member state of the European Union. The status of Britain still living and working in the EU and their EU counterparts in the UK has been one of the hottest issues in the Brexit process. And British MPs have highlighted serious problems with residence rules affecting British citizens who were already living in the EU before Brexit. Around 1.3 million Britons currently live in the EU and have obtained residence status in a member state. And earlier this year, the Danish government announced plans to amend its domestic law to lift the deportation threat for UK nationals who were late in applying for residency status. There are similar problems in other member states. For example, Sweden has already deported over 1,000 British nationals. In May, the UK Parliament's European Union Committee contacted Home Secretary Suella Braverman, noting that funding to support British citizens in the EU had been cut significantly since 2021. In addition, there is no longer an official organization advising Brits resident in the EU, nor is there an equivalent to the independent watchdog tasked with protecting the rights of EU citizens in the UK. At the latest meeting of the EU-UK Citizens' Rights Committee, UK ministers claimed that UK nationals who have not applied for permanent residence are having difficulty accessing benefits and services. Yeah, that's the point. If they haven't applied for permanent residency, they don't have the full rights in all member states. But a lot of those problems that UK citizens have in the EU is kind of a consequence not only from Brexit, that has consequences in tons of places, but also that they did not fulfill all legal requirements before Brexit. In a lot of countries in the EU, you have to register when you live there. And if you haven't done that before Brexit, you have no proof at all that you have legally stayed in those countries. Of course, as an EU member, you can move and work to every EU country, but you still have to uphold the laws of that country. And that caused a lot of those trouble for UK citizens. And of course, the ECJ ruling is as expected. The British voters on that day in 2016 decided to leave the EU. It was not a binding referendum, but the government at the time promised that they would still follow suit, and they did in the end. And that was it's nice that the word works the other way around as well. It was a sovereign decision of the United Kingdom to leave the EU. But if you make decisions, you have to live with the consequences. And in the case of a vote, especially one where there are still a lot of people that are affected by this now, have to blame themselves for not going to vote on that day, it is a democratic decision. And if a government has a majority in a country, that happened via a democratic decision. That in the UK, a government doesn't have to have that many votes to get in a majority in parliament is a different task. But it is the legal system there and the legal voting system. And when the other side won, they were always happy about that system because they didn't change it either, although they had the chance to. And so this is just one more point where we all know Brexit is a gift that keeps on giving. Brexit will stay with us, and Brexit means Brexit. You can't keep the benefits. I don't want to come now again with a have the cake and eat it, but that's exactly what some people still think. But nevertheless, this will not be the last Brexit video on this channel. By the way, have a look in the video description if you haven't done so yet, and had a look at all the other Outside Views channels, because there are loads of videos on different topics, from books via global politics to gaming. And I'll see you there. I'll be back.